Hello, everyone. I am here with Sam Rosen, who is Director of Product Management for Identity at Salesforce, and we're going to chat about the new OAuth flows that are out there. So let's get into it. To get started, let's talk about when this all happened. When did these new flows start to appear in Salesforce documentation? Because I know I opened it one day and I was like, wait a second, this looks a lot different than it did for many years.
No, we've been really busy. When I joined Salesforce, one of my primary goals was really to uplift our capabilities around authentication and authorization. And these new flows are honestly the start of that hard work over the last few years. So we're really excited about it. Some of these flows showed up probably about a year and a half ago, specifically the hybrid flows, and we'll talk a little bit about those. The client credential flow showed up probably about 6 months ago. And our new headless identity flows, the authorization code and credential flow, as an example, showed up actually in, believe, our spring release. And we'll have several updates in summer, and we'll also have updates in the winter release as well. And we'll talk about all those.
The flows that we supported as Salesforce for a while have remained relatively static. So what inspired this new change? Is there anything new that's happening under the hood that allows us to support these additional flows?
It's really, I would say there are a few things. So let's maybe start with one of our new flows, the client credential flow.
Perfect.
So, client credential flow for those who work outside of the Salesforce world is the primary way you do system-to-system integrations when you have a trusted server and another trusted server that need to talk to each other. And the reason people love the client credential flow is it's simple. Fundamentally, and all the OAuth purists out there, please don't be mad at me. It's really just a username password flow. The only difference is the username is your client ID, the password is your client secret, and there's some additional trust and protections, and you take that and you post it against the token endpoint and you get an access token. It's an incredibly simple flow. And it is used broadly, and still, if you buy an off-the-shelf application and want to integrate it, 9 out of 10 times, it's going to support client credential out of the box. Now, client credential had a problem, though, at Salesforce. At Salesforce, everything we do is in the context of a user, a named user, because that's how we enforce all of our security and really all of our authorization within the platform. Client credential flow, though, doesn't traditionally have a user. It's a system. It's a system-to-system integration.
Yep.
So up until I came and joined the team, Salesforce's perspective on client credential was that it didn't really make sense in the context of the platform. And that's why we still support the legacy OAuth 2 username password flow, which, by the way, is in the process of being deprecated out. You'll notice that net new orgs can't use it anymore unless they physically go turn it on. Don't worry, we're not getting rid of it. It's just we want to guide you guys away from it.
Yeah, not a best practice, right? That sort of defeats the purpose of using some of these more sophisticated flows.
That's exactly right. But so with the client credential flow, what we essentially did was we introduced a way for you to specify a run as user. So now when you can set up your connected app, you can enable it for the client credential flow. That's an explicit opt-in that's actually done by an admin, not the original developer. So the developer has to say that this app works with the client credential flow. The admin in the installing org actually has to enable it and set that run as user. And we did that for security purposes because technically you need to think about it as the client ID and client secret is a single username password. And if the same app is installed on multiple orgs, it's really one way to get into many, many orgs. So from a security perspective, you always need to keep that in mind. So we made the opt-in specifically your choice as the admin. When you install the app, a developer can't do that on behalf of you. So with this run as user, we got around the problem of how do we do a system-to-system integration, but where Salesforce requires that user. And you can think about this as a easier way to integrate than, for example, the job bearer flow.
Right.
So
that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, so that was our Salesforce's answer to how do you do trusted system-to-system integrations, was the job bearer flow. And that works really well with our process and our system because you specify a subject, which is a user, and you always get an access token in the name of that user.
Right.
And you're trying to decide, which one do I use? Client credential, job bearer? It comes down to really two fundamental questions. One, does your integration natively support one or the other?
Right.
Don't go build something custom if you don't have to. Stay away from that. But two, does your integration require one or many user contexts in the context of your Salesforce org?
Okay.
If it only requires one context, the client credential flow is the right way to do it because it can only have a single user context, that single
Right.
run as. However, the job bearer flow, technically, you can specify on any round of token exchange,
Hmm.
whichever subject you need.
Okay.
So you can technically have a multi-user integration that runs through a single pipe with the job bearer flow.
Interesting. Do you have an example of one of those multi-user scenarios when that would be useful?
Yeah, so let's pretend, for example, you're not using Experience Cloud and you have a core org that maybe is doing something like order management or just traditional CRM tasks. And you want updates to flow into the system, not on behalf of a system integration user, but actually on behalf of the user that is making the update directly.
Mm.
So for example, I have a e-commerce site, let's call it, and I chose to buy licenses for each of the users on my e-commerce site, but I don't use Salesforce as the identity provider.
Okay.
But I want the orders to flow into my CRM system where I'm going to do all my order management, order processing as the end user.
Hmm.
So in that situation, your e-commerce site would be set up. There'd be a trusted integration with job bearer flow. You would have a way within the e-commerce site to map your e-commerce user to your Salesforce Experience Cloud user.
Hmm.
And then when an order is submitted on the e-commerce site, you would do a job bearer flow with the subject for the user who submitted the
Got
order.
it.
And
Got it.
then that user's access token would update the CRM system
Got it.
and add the order
Interesting.
in.
Excellent. Okay, so it sounds like that is a big differentiator. And I love that you said, sort of use the most direct path in engineering. Like if your application supports one or the other, don't fight it. Now we have more
Yeah.
options, it sounds like.
It's
Salesforce.
exactly right. And in general, you don't really need user-specific integrations like that unless you're in what I would call a heavily audited industry. So,
Okay.
for example, if you're in the healthcare and life sciences industry and you're doing something like sample management, yeah, you want to know that Dr. Smith was the one who ordered the sample, and you want Dr. Smith's user to have updated the record that said you dispersed or sent out a sample.
Yep.
Makes total sense.
Right. Right.
Consumer case, if you don't have an auditing reason for it, why overcomplicate it?
That makes sense to me. So that is client credentials. What about, I know you mentioned the headless flows that are
Mhm.
relatively new. Let's dive into those.
Yeah, so those actually, it's something I've wanted to do for over 7 years. So prior to joining Salesforce, I worked as a system integrator where essentially I did large-scale identity and consent deployments on top of the Salesforce platform for the healthcare and life sciences industry. And at the end of the day, people care about their brand image and their brand experience.
Hmm.
Um, and unfortunately, that sometimes flies in the face of traditional identity and access management concepts. So if we think about OpenID Connect and OAuth and all the standards bodies, their perspective, and they have very good reason for this, is to say, hey, you redirect your user from your application to the identity provider for login.
Right.
And you do the same thing for registration and for forgot password and password reset. And you do that because of a bunch of security reasons,
Hmm.
primarily around domain control. But that's all well and good until you have a company that maybe has 100 different brands that do not cross-pollinate their brand
Hmm.
image. They might cross-pollinate the user, but they don't cross-pollinate the brand image. Or you have a customer who really wants to have a pixel perfect experience on
Hmm.
an off-platform application, and they want to figure out how to plug Salesforce, Salesforce Identity, and all the goodness of the platform into that application. So how do you do it? And the answer is you have to provide headless APIs for essentially authentication.
Hmm.
So all of these new OAuth flows are actually technically proprietary. They're based on open
Okay.
standards, but they are technically proprietary because there is no open standard for headless authentication.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay.
and that's something we're hoping the standards bodies are going to pay attention to. We spent a lot of time talking with several people in the standards bodies around how do we do this? What do we think about this? And candidly, a lot of them said, we don't want to do this.
Right.
But it doesn't change the fact that if you look at our competitors, Okta, Ping Federate, Auth0, and several others, they actually do have headless APIs in the background. Now, candidly, I think we did ours really well, and I want to tell you why. So, the base flow is called the authorization code and credential flow.
Okay.
And we called it that because it's based on the OAuth authorization code flow, or within the Salesforce universe, we refer to this as the web server code flow.
Right.
The idea here is that you do a standard authorization code flow. So the client reaches out via the authorized endpoint to the server. You authenticate the IDP. You return a code. The client exchanges the code for an access token.
Right.
The difference is we've made it now possible via headers to essentially send the username and password as a header during that authorization call. And now we don't need to show them a login screen. We can just process it.
Interesting.
And then we chose to CORS enable our authorized endpoint. And we created a new endpoint called I actually don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it's a new endpoint that essentially echoes the information you get back from the code response. Now, these things come together to essentially allow you to make an AJAX call from a web application with CORS enabled and post the username and password to authorize completely headlessly with no redirects and get back the code response. And that's all done securely because in the browser context, because it's entirely CORS enabled. Your redirect URL is, I believe, our new OAuth 2 echo endpoint. And essentially, the browser handles all that redirects for you. So from your perspective as a developer, you made a single post to authorize, and you got back a code response. In reality, that response was routed to authorize. The username password was validated. It was then routed to your callback URL, which is our code echo endpoint. And then we echoed the data back to you. And that's all handled by the browser automatically for you.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool. And we made it work for public and private clients because we're able to choose whether you send the secret with the code exchange or whether you omit it. And that's a choice that from a security perspective, it's up to you as our customer to make.
Right. And let's double click on that. So for the public clients, let's give an example of a public client. And I'm assuming that would be without the secret.
Yep, that's exactly right. So 2 examples of public clients. One would be a mobile app that you ship out into the world. The reality is no matter how you try and hide that secret, I can decompile the binary and I can get to it. So your secret's gone. You really can only use the client ID. And that's an example of a public client. Another example, though, is single page web apps. So people are loving SPAs, and I have a lot of personal opinions on them, and they're completely irrelevant for this conversation, but people love SPAs. And depending upon how you built them, sometimes your app really is just JavaScript that loads into the browser. And at that point, you're not going to be able to protect the secret either. Now, if you have a backing web server and you're going to route calls through that web server, which is what you should do, then that's not technically a public client. And it would be a private client, and you should store the secret. But those are 2 examples. And the question you should ask is, can I protect the secret? I.e., is the secret in a place that no one can get to it? And I don't care how you encrypt it. If you ship it to the client, they're going to get to it. Doesn't matter.
Yep, absolutely. And for these new headless flows, are there any gotchas or anything folks should maybe avoid doing with them?
You shouldn't shoehorn them into a place that it makes sense to use a traditional redirect flow. At the end of the day, what you need to realize if you're going to implement these flows are you have to implement them fully. They are going to take more effort. We don't have an SDK today. We're hoping in the future, forward-looking statement, safe harbor, that we're going to ship an SDK to you guys, hopefully in 3 or 4 releases. But until then, you basically have to implement the flows and then the session management and all of the protection yourself. Completely doable, completely possible. We have customers already actually actively doing that work today because they're so excited about it. But if you can use a head full flow that is based on an open standard that you can use a standard library for, you should go do that. And to be even more clear, at the end of the day, our headless flows are not as secure as our headful ones. At the end of the day, you are making a trade-off, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is you're technically training users to enter credentials not on your identity provider's login screen, which at the end of the day makes them more vulnerable to phishing.
Right.
And there's not, and other than CORS, there's not a great way to protect that. Now, CORS is great, except when someone chooses to do something a little weird. As an example, if I'm not in the browser, CORS means nothing. which means that if I, for example, set up a web server
Mm-hmm.
and on the front end in the browser, I put up a username password. But on the back end, but when you submit it, instead of doing that on the browser, I submit that back into my web server.
Yep.
And then I start the authentication flow from there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to be allow listed through CORS, and I don't even have to have access to your callback URL.
Ah.
Because technically, the 302 redirect will come back via the web server, and I can inspect the 302 redirect, and I can grab your code.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's no way around these issues.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why we ship these flows actually default off.
Okay.
So you as an admin need to make a decision. Do I even want to allow my org to use these flows?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is yes, go for it. And more importantly, once you go for it, every connected app that you plan to use those flows also has to be opted in. So there's an org opt-in and an app opt-in that you have to perform, because we really want you to be very targeted in the way you deploy this, because we don't want you to accidentally open up any security vulnerabilities. The other thing is these flows don't work for internal users. So anyone who logs in via login.salesforce.com or your My Domain, these flows don't work for them. They only work for your customers' users, i.e. your Experience Cloud users, because that's where you need that pixel perfect experience.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And again, this is a choice. Pixel perfect experience, still secure, not best in class.
Got it.
Or I want best in class security, then redirect experiences are the right answer.
Okay, gotcha. So we've talked about the 3 headless flows, right? So headless registration flow for public clients. We talked about that for private clients as well. And then, we haven't talked about actually the headless forgot password flow, which as a maybe former admin, former person who's done that, that's really exciting to me. So what should we know about that flow?
Yeah, so in general, headless registration, headless authentication, headless forgot password are part of what I'm calling the headless arc. How do we allow you guys to create login experiences natively on your applications and cover the entire set of use cases? So you never have to redirect to Experience Cloud if you don't want to. So headless registration is obviously how we register someone. Headless authentication is how we log them in. Today, that's username, password. In the summer release, we've introduced the ability to log in with an SSO provider. And in the winter release, we will introduce the ability to do passwordless login as well. So just log in with email or log in with SMS. So we'll essentially have feature parity with most of the ways we can log in headfully on the platform. And then headless forgot password is essentially how you can run a forgot password flow. So what's really interesting about that one, at least to me, is how do you do that headlessly when traditionally you get an email with a link?
Right.
And if you click on that link, it brings you to Experience Cloud. And how do we as Salesforce create a way for you to do all of that without a massive amount of customization in your app and without, honestly, a massive amount of configuration on our side? And the answer is we kind of avoid all of it using one-time passcodes. So the flow essentially is a user comes to your site and types in their email address. Really, it's their username in the background. It's however you want to map to that. It's fine, but it's the username. And they go through a reCAPTCHA challenge if it's a public client. We've natively integrated reCAPTCHA into both headless registration and forgot password. So all you have to do is fill in your reCAPTCHA v2 or v3 config, and that's for public clients. For private clients, you would use a integration user to do this. So there's 2 different ways you can secure these endpoints. But the user types in their username, they go through a reCAPTCHA challenge, you submit that data. The result is we send an email with a one-time passcode to the end user, and your app collects the one-time passcode along with their new password. And then you submit that. That's how we prove ownership of the email address, is that one-time passcode process. And on your end, all you have to do is now create a new one-time passcode email template for forgot password. And that's it.
That's
and
awesome.
By the way, and for all those people with multiple brands out there, and you're like, wait, you're going to force me to use one email template for everyone? No, we thought of that. So we do have a way. There's a default email template, but we actually have a way during that process for you to specify the email template at time of call. So if you have 10 brands, you can have 10 email templates in the background and completely support your branding experience.
Awesome. Awesome. So, and I think that maybe there's one more flow we wanted to talk about before we're done, which is the authorization and session management for hybrid apps. Talk a little bit about that one.
So I assume most people out there are familiar with the idea of hybrid applications in general, and that you traditionally see them in mobile apps. And the idea is that you have your native experience, you have some native pages, you have some native underlying code that's running on the device. But at the end of the day, you probably built some really great things in Experience Cloud, and why in the world are you going to rebuild those experiences? Let's just bring them into the app. And if it was a web browser, I would say you're iframing them in, but essentially you're bringing them in via WebView. Now, when you authenticate, you get an access token, a refresh token, but now you're going to load a web view. And how do we get a session into that web view?
Right. Yeah.
Now, Salesforce has always supported the ability to bridge an access token through front door. And there's a document around that, and it talks about the idea if you take the access token, you post it to a special URL, and we essentially build all the sessions required, and it loads the web view for you.
Is that like a Canvas? Is that how Canvas is supported, or is that different?
Yeah, Canvas is a little different, but it's a similar, it's a very similar concept. And essentially the idea is that, you authenticate to your mobile app, you click on a button that ends up opening a hybrid view, and then basically you shove that token through front door, and you load up the view, and it's in an authenticated state. That's how we did it before. And that's actually how the Salesforce mobile app worked and how we did it within Salesforce. And the issue we ran into internally was our mobile experience wasn't good. You had session timeouts. You had what I think people referred to as the white screen of death. And I wish I could say that that's not technically our fault on the identity team, but that's our fault. That's not their fault. And the issue they were running into was you get an access token, you get a web session, but they're not connected, and there's no way to figure out how to tie these things together. So what the mobile teams had to do, and what you have to do if you've implemented a hybrid app, is you have to literally watch the web view, and anytime it goes to load, you need to see if it gets a 401 or a 403, or you redirect or a 303 to the login page. And if you see that, that's when you got to stop it and shove yourself back through front door. And that's a terrible experience. So with the hybrid flows, what we essentially did was we gave you the ability to request all of the tokens. So your CSRF token, your session ID, your Visualforce session ID, your content session ID, along with the access token. And every time you refresh, you also get back the list of IDs. And what you can do is now in the web view on the device, you can actually load the web view with those IDs all pre-populated.
Gotcha.
So you don't have to go through front door anymore. And because access token timeouts and our session timeouts are actually the same, which is always weird for people when they first start working with the platform, but we have a method to our madness. Because those things are the same, now they stay in sync much more often. So when your access token expires, you refresh, you get new SIDs, and you populate those SIDs into the hybrid view, essentially, and you just keep refreshing in that process.
Got it. So is our mobile app now using this flow?
Yeah, so that flow is actually the oldest flow. It's been around for at least a year. Salesforce Mobile has already pushed out an update some time ago. So everybody's running on this new code base. And it works really well. For the most part, we don't have a ton of customer adoption, not because we don't want it, but because for a lot of our customers, the front door path has worked very successfully. But if you want to build a hybrid mobile app, you really should look at these flows. And we support it on our web server code flow, and we support it on our code and credential flow as well. So even a native app, so native login, native identity, can also make use of all these features as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Awesome. So one last question. Cool. Anything on the roadmap that you want to highlight or share? Anything you think architects might be really excited about when it comes to authorization?
Absolutely. And I assume safe harbor as always.
Safe harbor as always. Yes.
Awesome. So I already mentioned that for our headless flows, we have the passwordless flows coming. We're going to support reCAPTCHA Enterprise for registration and forgot password as well. That's really important for mobile in
Mhm.
particular, because we love our friends at Google, but Google does not support reCAPTCHA V2 or V3 in a native mobile app. So we want to make sure that there was a way for our customers to utilize reCAPTCHA in a native mobile app setting as well. So that's kind of exciting. We've already talked about passwordless login and our new
Right.
passwordless login capabilities. Uh, um, and we're also looking at high volume registration for headless registration. So the ability to handle thousands of requests a minute.
Mm.
Um, and we're going to do that via a system very similar to how Experience Cloud already does micro batch registration, if those who are familiar with that. So those are some things that we're really excited about there. Another thing that we're looking at is we're actually looking at implementing the OAuth 2 token exchange
Okay.
process. So essentially, this will allow you to, for example, take a Azure AD token and exchange it for a Salesforce Access token directly.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
and that's going to be really helpful for customers who have a wider enterprise landscape. And they need to essentially get access to Salesforce, and Salesforce is also not the IDP, and IDP chaining is not the right way to do it in their use case.
Got it. So
Um,
that would be, so instead of using something like OpenID Connect, that would be
it
leveraging that.
it's essentially a way to take a token that you already got from a trusted system
Hmm.
and get access to Salesforce without going completely around the circle again.
Got it.
Because at Salesforce, we're always going to require you to use our tokens to access our system. Um, the question is, can we make it easier for you to get from one token to our token?
Hmm.
And we want to open up that path for you. The
Very
other big
cool.
thing we're bringing on from a security standpoint also is the auth provider framework in our next release is going to get the ability to require Pixie. So you'll be able to set up proof. I think Pixie is proof key code exchange. I think that's what it stands for. But essentially, it's really important in the security world from an OAuth and OpenID Connect perspective because it adds a level of validation that prevents man-in-the-middle attacks.
Right.
So auth providers today, you could technically make work with Pixie, but we didn't make it easy. So soon you're going to have a checkbox that you can literally check, and we'll handle the Pixie portion of
Nice.
the flow for you and auth providers. So that's a big security uplift coming. Similarly, on the connected app side, we've always supported Pixie, and we support it for many years at this point.
Hmm.
But most people actually don't realize it's there,
Right.
and there's no way to require it, which
Okay.
I'll be candid, kind of defeats the purpose because if an attacker wants to, they just construct the request without Pixie and it still works.
Hmm.
So the other thing that's coming in our next release is the ability to require Pixie. And you'll actually be able to do that in two places. You'll, as an admin, be able to do it at the org level and say
Okay.
all integrations into the org using an OAuth flow that could support Pixie now must use Pixie. Be very careful when you change that setting. It will break most
Mm.
things. But if you want to take a very aggressive security posture, that is the way to do it. And we're giving you that feature. That is default off because it will break most things in testing.
Yes, absolutely.
But at the app level, you'll be able to turn it on for each individual app as well. So if you have apps that you know should require Pixie, or if you want to take a perspective that any new app integrated
Hmm.
into your org should require Pixie, you'll be able to do that from the connected app directly.
Awesome. Very cool. So lots to look forward to, even more coming. Dreamforce is just around the corner. But for now, Sam, thank you so much for your time. This was lovely to chat, and I hope to see you back here sometime soon.
Awesome. It was really a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.